When I was a kid watching Planet of the Apes, I thought to myself, man, humanity really got screwed over. But after watching the Planet of the Apes trilogy, bro, what is wrong with humanity in these movies? It's sort of like how in The Matrix, humans are just otherworldly levels of giant losers, but instead of giant robots that can tear us apart, we're just turds to giant monkeys that can tear us apart. And tear us apart they do. You see, taking place throughout Rise, Dawn, and War for the Planet of the Apes, humanity got screwed up big time. In an effort to cure the unfortunate but natural effects of aging, specifically Alzheimer's, more aggressive means were needed to alter the human genome to create an effective medicine to combat the horrendous march of time. We turn to what we normally turn to when testing potential medicines that could, body us, apes. In this case, chimpanzees who share similar reactions and traits to humanity, but not as valued in terms of their lives. After administering the newly concocted medicine, it would result in the apes, who were highly intelligent, pretty much rivaling humans in most aspects, but humanity would still continue to regard them as animals. Spitting in the face of these apes and their preference for peace, humanity would engage in a war with the apes that would ultimately spell our undoing and give birth to the abomination that was Marky Mark in Planet of the Apes. Now, God, it's horrible. So today it's pretty clear what we were discussing, just exactly what this medicine is, how it affects the minds of apes, how it originally was supposed to help humans, and why there appears to be such a detraction between humans and apes concerning the more aggressive version of the medicine, and why this is actually a fairly expected outcome. Alright, so for all the new people here, first, thank you for the 500,000 subs. Without you guys, literally none of this would have been possible. And seeing as there are a lot of new faces around here, I'll go through my usual spiel. Up on screen, you'll see a timestamp. If you would like to skip ahead past the summary of the trilogy, that will kind of dive into the science of the movie and how the specific virus affects humans and apes. However, if you would like to stick around and listen to the sweet, sultry sounds of my voice, that is also appreciated. Alright, so let's get to this long summary of, the beginning, which is Rise of the Planet of the Apes. We open up our story in the jungles of somewhere, and I'm assuming it's Africa considering that's where we find chimpanzees. A group of chimps is being chased by humans and are getting snatched up left, right, and center. After being loaded onto a cart, the troop attempts to run after those captured, but to no avail. Then we jump across the planet to see a green-eyed chimp. Currently, she is undergoing an intelligence test, which I have done myself, and I can't even solve that test that quickly. And seeing as Bright Eyes, the ape, is solving the test so quickly, Will, the researcher, runs to his boss, Steven, to tell him that they are ready to move on to human trials with this breakthrough, and he's ready to show the board. Will begins his presentation discussing the virus known as ALZ-112 or ALZ-112, doesn't really matter, but it has been given to the ape to create neurogenesis, but in reality their main goal is to cure Alzheimer's. Everyone is pretty stoked, and back in the holding area they are attempting to get Bright Eyes out of her cell. As they do, okay man, the body language clearly shows that she's guarding something underneath the bed, but these guys are big brainy brains, I guess, and actually, you know what, these scientists are too bright. They attempt to force Bright Eyes out of her cage. Back in the meeting, Will goes on discussing how there are no ill effects to the dose except that it turns the iris green. In theory, the cure would fix a wide array of human genetic diseases. As they are all high-fiving about all the money they're gonna make, Bright Eyes then bursts through the glass and then is taken out on the table. Steven is pretty upsetty spaghetti and says that they are all contaminated and need to be taken out. He orders Robert to take out all the apes in the facility. Steven allows Will to stay on with the company but tells him to, just like with his old man, take the cure back to formula perhaps? Which kind of bums out Will. While euthanizing the apes, Robert finds out that Bright Eyes was actually trying to protect her child and then makes the decision that Will needs to take the ape home. Will has now doomed the planet of the apes. Arriving home, we find out that Will's dad isn't doing so hot, which is kind of a big driving force behind why Will is even trying to cure Alzheimer's. Will shows his dad Caesar and says don't get too attached, but well, he's gonna get attached as we all know. The next morning, we see how far along into dementia the father is. Forgetting that he hasn't driven in years, he's the first to notice that Caesar is displaying traits well beyond what a day-old ape should, and that his eyes are also green. Fast forward 3 years later, and we go through a montage about how super cool Caesar is. His skills advance faster than that of a normal human, and by comparison at that age. His neurons are advancing faster than his own species to boot. A fight then breaks out between Will's dad and the nurse, which prompts Will to just straight up jack some of the ALZ-112 virus that he knows will work. He injects his father with the virus in hopes that it will cure him or at least stave off the Alzheimer's. The next morning, his dad is downstairs downstairs playing the piano and clearly is better. His father begins discussing how he has been cured and he feels 100% back to normal. Checking his vitals, Will doesn't pay attention to where Caesar is, and then he gets outside. He heads to the neighbor's garage where he's discovered by a little girl. The dad then comes out with a bat and begins swinging at him, but Will gets to him just before Caesar is badly injured. He did get a cut on his leg, which prompts a visit to the hot zoo doctor, or veterinarian if you like, and then they decide to start dating. Not really important, but just so you know, there's a love interest. We go through the whole bonding thing, as you do, and then they decide to take Caesar out into the woods so that he can get some freedom. They take off Caesar's leash, and Caesar then extends his hand as a gesture of asking for permission. Caesar then runs through the woods, and then we get this montage of him running through the woods for like years, having massive chimp energy, and then he looks like that one ape Professor Farnsworth created in Futurama for a while. But then a family and their dog show up, and then Caesar sees the dog wearing a leash too. And this prompts Caesar to ask if he's a pet. They assure him that he's not, but maybe not. We put kids on leashes nowadays too. Caesar then asks about his parents and asks what he is, which is an interesting question for an animal to ask. And I believe the only other animal to ask this was a parrot that they taught to speak, and then it asked before it died what it was or something like that. I can't remember specifically. Anyways, it really doesn't matter to this. Will then shows him the facility that he was born in, and then Will tells him that his mother ate lead, so he raised him. So the veterinarian now is asking questions, and it comes out that the ALZ 112 virus can be passed along genetically to offspring, and that Caesar has some of the traits that his mother had. Meanwhile, the dad is using a fork backwards, showing that something appears to be amiss with his brain. Looking into it, he discovers that the virus is being thwarted by the immune system, meaning that the Alzheimer's is coming back. Meanwhile, the dad then wanders outside and gets into the neighbor's Mustang. The neighbor yells at the dad, which makes Caesar upsetty as he begins attacking the neighbor. The neighbor makes a run for it, but Caesar is about to clap them cheeks when he comes to his senses and then realizes what he's doing, and then goes on to check on the dad as the people back away. The cops then show up along with animal control and then moves him to his new home. They let Caesar out into his play area, which at first I think he thinks it's pretty neato, and then Will is forced to leave him there while he appeals his sentencing to the sanctuary. Caesar quickly realizes that it's really just him being abandoned, and he doesn't like it. And then the most needlessly ridiculous character arrives. Malfoy here is being a turbo douche to everyone, and then locks Caesar in a cage as the rest of the chimps freak out at a newcomer. It's a madhouse, I tell ya. Back at home, it's clear the dad is degrading quickly. ALZ 112 is no longer effective at all, and for some reason his brain is degrading even faster than normal, which didn't make a lot of sense until I sat down and thought about it, but we'll kind of talk about that later. Will then spills the beans to his boss that he already did human testing on his father and that ALZ 112 did work, but he developed antibodies. Will says that he needs a more aggressive virus to make sure the body can't resist, and oh man, this turns out to be a great plan. Again, Malfoy is just a complete loser to everyone. I half expected him to keep saying Pata, honestly, and the red sweater on Caesar isn't working. The other worker is just sort of spineless, and that'll probably save him later, but back at the labs, Steven awarded Will with a bunch of apes to try ALZ 113 on, and this is where we meet Koba, and this is the ape that would actually doom everyone. During an experiment on the ape, Robert is inadvertently exposed to ALZ 113 when his mask is kicked off. Always make sure your PPE is on properly, my dude. And here is where we get the great exposure event, and this is why quarantine is so important. Anyhow, back at the sanctuary, the other chimps don't really like Caesar and what he is wearing and then begin attacking him, or at least the alpha does. Malfoy runs out and tranks them both and then brings them back to their cages. Meanwhile, back in the lab, Koba is showing an increased intelligence, showing that the virus is in fact working. Robert, though, appears to be having an immune response. Back at the sanctuary, Maurice, the giant orangutan, signals that he knows sign language, but the people don't like smart apes. Will notices the injury on Caesar and then asks if he'd been hurt when he goes to check on him. Not important, but just know that resentment is growing as Caesar is left behind once more. Later that night, Malfoy, a dude, and a couple girls show up to look at the monkeys. He sort of screws with them, because human bad, and Caesar is able to steal the other guy's pocket knife and then just mean mugs Malfoy. Honestly, at this point, I haven't even looked up his real name. He's just Malfoy. Anyways, Caesar later unlocks his cage and then releases the giant gorilla inside, who's afraid to come out of his cage, but he's been stuck in there so long. Eventually, he does come out and is thankful for the freedom. They then wake up the alpha and show that Caesar doesn't want to fight, which now makes Caesar the alpha as the original alpha submits. Back at Will's home, he's about ready to give his father the ALZ 113, but it seems that the old man is pretty much done for, so he ends up crashing out in the middle of the night. Or at least that's what's implied by the black suits that they're wearing the next morning. Or it seems like the next morning. It's probably not the next morning. Anyways, Steven now is up for human testing since Koba appears way smarter than normal and it's sustained. Will mentions how they still don't know what's going to happen with humans, so they need to stop testing and definitely not test on humans just yet. Steven pretty much ignores this. Back at his house though, Robert is definitely sick. He's trying to get help from Will as a neighbor then shows up and confronts him, but gets blood sneezed on him, and we now have a spreading event. Way to go, scientists. Will pays off the sanctuary and then goes to get Caesar. However, Caesar then shuts the door on Will and does not want to go home with them. Definitely a good use of a couple $1,000s, but this has cemented Caesar in his leadership because he chose to stay rather than flee. Caesar now has a plan. He gives the old alpha a cookie and is distributed amongst everyone to further show that he is the leader. With power secured, Maurice then asks why he did it, and then we get the ape strong together line. The orangutan says apes are stupid and then walks off. Later that night, he makes his escape and then steals a batch of ALZ 113, and using the pocket knife from earlier, he stabs the canisters and releases it in the sanctuary, making all the apes smarter. The next morning, the apes wake up seeing the world in a different way as Malfoy bangs on the doors and cages. Checking all the apes' eyes, they have turned green, showing that the plan has worked perfectly. Okay, so here on the TV, we get a reference to the Planet of the Apes astronauts who go through like a wormhole and get sent to the future of Earth, which is actually a pretty neat callback. As the owner of the sanctuary looks on, he notices that the apes are acting strange. Back at Franklin's apartment, he has succumbed to ALZ 113, and I know we're jumping around, but that's just how this movie is. Anyways, we now get a fight between Malfoy and Caesar, and I just don't get the point. Chimps can literally rip your arms off, dude. Anyhow, we get the classic, "Get your stinking paws off me, you damn dirty ape," as Caesar yells no, showing that he is now capable of speech, which you may be as smart as you want, but the throat structure does not allow it, and we'll discuss that later. Anyhow, the group attacks the spineless dude for a minute, but Caesar places him in a cage and stops him from being Shrek'd. Malfoy is then taken out by an electric shot from the fire hose and his baton. I mean, this honestly needed to happen, so really no loss there. And now the apes all ascend out of the sanctuary and move out into the surrounding area. Later on, back at the sanctuary, they watch the tape showing how Malfoy got wrecked as the chimps began assaulting the medical labs and freeing the rest of the apes. Steven is then alerted that Franklin has succumbed to the disease and walks in to find the building is vandalized. Out at the zoo, the apes are also being set free to bolster their numbers further. After an all-out assault in the city to free their captured brethren, they then move to the Golden Gate Bridge to make their way out of the city entirely. Eventually, the cops show up to ruin the fun, as usual, and corner the apes. Okay, so the cops show up with batons. Bro, how are you gonna take out a 500-pound silverback gorilla with a baton? Like, how can you be so aggressive towards something that much stronger than you, but also be so stupid as to show up with a stick? Anyhow, this just shows the poor planning on humanity's part. But as the apes are fired upon by a helicopter, it is then brought down, and Steven is in it in the process, as he was on that chopper, even though it was completely unnecessary for him to be on that chopper. Off the bridge, Will gives chase in a cop car and then heads off into the forest looking for Caesar. Koba is the first to find him and tries to attack, but Caesar throws him off. Will tries to convince Caesar to come home, but respects his decision to stay in the forest and lead his monkey people. Also, the neighbor then goes into work feeling a little under the weather and has a nosebleed, and this spreads the disease far and wide, which at this point we know happens pretty easily. And this leads us into Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. Humanity is totally screwed by a pandemic. We actually open up Dawn of the Planet of the Apes with news reports stating if you have a sore throat, stay home. However, as the disease continues, people become erratic, aggressive, and civil unrest ensues. Totally not what humanity does anyways. Dubbed the simian flu, it is stated that only about 1 in 500 people are capable of surviving the virus, which puts us at just 16 million humans left. Back to focusing on Monkey, they are hunting in the trees. They have established themselves as a major presence in the redwood forest. Caesar now has a son who is immediately attacked by a bear. He shouts for help as Koba comes flying dagger style and then stabs the bear in the back and then takes it out. Heading back to camp, they now have set up an ape society, but really it's not all that important. Just know Koba is sort of taking Caesar's son Blue Eyes under his wing as a secondary parental figure. Maurice is teaching the tenets of apedom, saying apes should not take one another out, but if they are related to us, they will anyhow, because humans do it, apes do it, everybody does it. I mean, look no further than, what was it? It was like a cave of, was it Heidelbergensis? A bunch of skulls of other Heidelbergensis were in this cave. Basically, it was a serial killer, just so you know. It goes that far back. Violent ape theory. Look it up, it's pretty interesting. Anyhow, after Caesar's return, his wife has just given birth to a second son, but it appears to be a hard birth and it puts her down for a while. Caesar talks to Maurice about how they wonder if humans are even still out there. It's been 10 winters, in the last 8 they have seen none, which means the human race ain't doing so well, it seems. Meanwhile, back outside the camp, 2 scouts run into a guy who we will all come to hate because his brain doesn't work so well. He ends up taking one of the scouts out and then yells to his group, who all arrive with force multipliers drawn, which honestly outclasses the force enhancers that the apes have. Caesar then calms his group down as Malcolm Malcolm yells they don't mean any harm, and then put down their tools to show that they aren't a threat. Caesar yells for them to go as the rest of the troop begins yelling the same thing, which is probably horrifying to hear. Maurice then finds the bag that was left over from the group, and then tells a few of the apes to follow the humans. Malcolm returns back to his zone, and then gets Dreas in the car and tells him about what happened. The dude just dismisses it immediately, and it's like, bro, you weren't even out there, and the whole truck is telling you what they saw. However, Carver is telling them how they probably left them alive just to backtrack them to their camp, which actually, I mean, it's a fair deduction, and it's true if I'm being honest. Dreas tells everyone to keep this information quiet as it would freak people out. In San Francisco, things aren't as good as they used to be. Most of the city, or what's left of it, are in one area. Back at the camp, they discuss what to do with Koba, saying that humans are dangerous and should be dealt with as in war. Some say that they should be peaceful, and Caesar tells everyone what they should do. Basically, this is their home, and the human home is over there. They should show up in force and let them know not to come back. That way, everyone wins and they can coexist, but coexist they do not. I mean, look no further than Homo sapiens and Neanderthal, really. The apes arrive the next day in a show of force as alarms are sounded in the human camp. Looking out at the apes, Malcolm goes to meet with them. Caesar says that he does not want war, but they will fight if they have to, and he makes it known that this city is the human home, but the forests are the apes' home. This sort of throws a wrench into the whole plan of using the dam to power their city when Caesar tells him not to come back. So what does Malcolm do? Well, he comes back. I mean, his hands are kind of tied, they do need power, but they do quite possibly the most moronic thing possible. They bring Carver, the guy that literally just shot a scout. Why do you bring Carver? It's clear the dude's marginally unstable, and he's got like a severe hatred for apes. Like, out of all the people, you could literally bring anybody else, or just don't bring an extra person at all. I just don't understand why this is necessary. Also, Dreas launches into some speech to calm everyone by telling them that he's scared. It's a great speech, boss man. However, Dreas does have a point that the power from the dam would allow them to reach out to the rest of the world and find out who's left, and then they could rebuild. But I don't know what's really stopping them now. They say they have 2 weeks of power left, but why not flip on a radio? Why do you need the dam's power? This part didn't make a lot of sense to me. Anyways, Malcolm sets off with his group to attempt to make peace long enough to get the dam working and get power. Out at the ape-controlled area, Malcolm then tells them to stay in the truck, do not leave, do not get out, just stay there and let him go make contact. Upon making contact with the ape camp, he's then pulled to Caesar and does like this groveling thing, like, come on my guy, stand up like a Homo sapiens. Anyhow, Caesar is baffled as to why he has come back, but agrees to hear him out. Malcolm tells him about the dam, and Caesar agrees to go there with them as the humans seem desperate. Back at the cars, Malcolm appears to say that they can work on the dam, but they have to leave their force multipliers behind. The apes break all of them as Koba tells Caesar if they get power, they will just use it to harm the apes because Koba knows humans. Ah, growing disagreement. You love to see it. Meanwhile, back at the forward operating camp, we get some exposition about how everything sucks in the world and everyone has lost someone. I mean, with 99.8% of the human population flatlined, I guess that's probably true. Also, Carver starts sowing anger amongst the group because they just had to bring Carver along in this delicate operation, which he has shown he can't be trusted considering he blew away one of the apes earlier, and then Caesar's wife is sick, so that kind of sucks too. Anyways, the next morning, the apes are ready to go and then meet up with the humans to head over to the dam. Koba, however, has other plans. He and a few others go back to the human stockpile area to see what they are up to. Humans being humans have a ton of force multipliers, and after running into a few humans who apparently didn't get the memo that there are super intelligent apes running around, finds Koba, but then they kind of let him go after he pretends to be just a normal chimpanzee, and I mean, that's an interesting idea. Back at the dam, the humans are discussing how everyone they know is pretty much gone, which is a pretty big bummer, and as they run some explosive line, they detonate it to free the turbines, which causes a small cave-in. The apes help pull the rocks off and then end up helping save the group, but Carver is slightly injured in the cave-in. And here's where Carver's brilliance comes out into play. The dude was told not to bring a force multiplier, but it's discovered that he did. The rest of the group didn't know this, but it basically breaks the tenuous trust. Caesar tells the humans to leave, so that's great. Way to go, Carver, you douche. But back at the monkey camp, Caesar's wife isn't looking so hot, and not just because she's a chimpanzee. Malcolm tries to rectify the misunderstanding, but luckily he happened to bring the CDC personnel with them. They give Caesar's wife a course of antibiotics, which should help with her infection, but Caesar says that they have to stay for one day to know if it's actually just straight up poison or not. Back at the human camp, they take Carver and then put him into a truck where he must stay. They should have just sent the dude walking home, but instead they keep him around. Koba then returns returns looking for Caesar and then heads up to the dam. He's a little upset at the humans, and when Caesar arrives, Koba accuses him of putting all the apes in danger and says that he loves humans more than apes. So Caesar beats the hell out of him, but unfortunately doesn't finish the job as he won't take out another ape. Could have saved a lot of problems there. Back at the ape camp, Koba tells Caesar's son that his father is just blind and doesn't see what he sees, which to a degree he's right. But this starts to win over Caesar's son to Koba's side. The next day, Koba shows back up to the human stockpile and then gets in close enough to the two humans to take their force multiplier, and then takes out the guards and steals a few of them to arm his own apes. But now the dam is back up and operational. As they bask in the glowy goodness of a crappy gas station, Caesar says he now trusts the humans, and I'm guessing it's because his wife is feeling better, but I'm not really sure why he trusts the humans all of a sudden. Meanwhile, Koba shows up and then takes out Carver, thank God, and back at the monkey camp is where part of the movie, everything's starting to seem like it's great right before things go horribly. San Francisco has power, everyone's feeling good. Surely nothing bad could happen, but bad it happen does indeed. I've been stuck on that statement for a while. Koba gets back to the camp and then lights it on fire. He then crawls up the rocks and takes out Caesar with a shot that injures him, but then leaves the human force multiplier behind to frame humanity. Maurice tells the humans to run at this point, and Koba then rallies the apes, saying humans did this and burned their home, and that they need to go on the offensive. Back at the human camp, everyone is partying because power has returned. Dreas looks at pictures of his family and has himself a good cry, but as everyone rages, they got the radios back up and working and are calling for help. The apes then attack the human stockpile and take all the force multipliers, or at least most of them. They lock down the encampment and then shut the doors, knowing an attack is on the way. Dreas goes on to say how they will not get through the doors, but that's quickly not realized. The apes begin their attack, which looks bad at first, more so when human armor support shows up, but like the geniuses that they are, they leave the hatch open, so an ape is able to get in there, and then actually it's Koba, and it quickly overwhelms them and takes them out, and then uses it to ram the door. Anyways, this attack is literally like 30 minutes of the movie. It's just pretty wild to watch. As the monkeys ransack the human camp, back at the monkey camp, Malcolm and his group find Caesar, who is still alive somehow. You'll find this ironic later in the third movie. I guess I should just say now, yeah, there's spoilers for this video naturally and all over the place. Anyways, Caesar then tells that an ape is the one that injured him. Back at the human encampment, people are being rounded up. Koba tells Ash to take out the human, but he retorts that Caesar wouldn't want this. So Koba then grabs him and throws him off a balcony, taking him out in the process, violating like one of their main tenets. Outside, people are being rounded up and put into cages and whatnot, and those that are loyal to Caesar are also put in chains as they are considered dangerous. So Malcolm and his group eventually stop at Caesar's old house where he used to live with Will. Malcolm then runs to go get equipment to work on Caesar, where then he runs into Caesar's son. He tells him that his father is still alive and then takes him to see him. After Blue Eyes meets Caesar, he then tells his son that it was Koba, and they remove the bullet from his side, saving his life. So Blue Eyes then proceeds to go back and free the captive. Caesar looks around his old house and deduces that his old pal Will had succumbed to the virus like so many other humans. Meanwhile, back at the sewers, the humans make contact with what's left of the US military, and Malcolm attempts to stop them, so Blue Eyes has enough time to stop what's happening. While this is going on, Caesar then crawls his way out of the house and finds Koba in the steel structuring of the building. They begin attacking one another, real damaging, good versus evil, all that jazz, and eventually Caesar is able to overpower Koba. Koba says the apes don't kill apes, but Caesar says he's not an ape and then lets him drop. With Caesar back in power, he talks to Malcolm about how there is war now that Koba has attacked and humans won't forgive, which is true. We don't forgive. I mean, we almost annihilated the wolf population just for eating some kids, so that happens. But he knows things can never really be fixed. He says humans here must go before the fighting begins in the area as the soldiers are coming. Because that throws us into the third movie, the trilogy War for the Planet of the Apes. Oh Lord, we are gonna get through this one way or another. We open up our story with a quick summation of what's happened. Rise, dawn, and war. Basically, humanity isn't doing so hot after the war broke out between humans and apes, coupled with the virus that ransacked our species, and now what's left of the US military is on the hunt for these intelligent apes in an effort to eradicate them. As a bunch of soldiers make their way through the redwood forest, they eventually spot a stronghold of apes on the ridge, but now we also have other monkeys working with humans in an effort to annihilate apes. As they set up their armaments, they launch a full-scale attack on the apes, blowing apart the ramparts and pushing them back up the hill. One manages to escape to warn the others and then get reinforcements. As reinforcements arrive, I have to ask this question because it's important. What even is the point of the soldier's body armor if it doesn't work? The spears made by monkeys are able to easily pierce it with like no effort. Anyhow, after the battle concludes, the remaining surviving soldiers are captured, but instead of being taken out, which is likely what Caesar should have done, he instead ties them to a horse and lets them walk. He's questioned about how do they know they they will send the message and that they just really won't come back and take them all out. And Caesar says that they are the message because he could have just ended them. Not sure, my boy. I wouldn't trust humans at this point. Anyhow, the Alpha Omega gorilla mentions how the Colonel is coming after Caesar and how he wants to take them all out, which riles up the group. The Alpha Omega gorilla then overwhelms the gorilla known as Winter and escapes back to the human soldiers' encampment. As the apes head back into their main home in the waterfall, eventually Caesar's son, Blue Eyes, returns home from scouting a way out of the forest. He mentions how on the other side of the mountains there's a large desert. Just so we're all aware, he's talking about the Rockies. That took an embarrassingly long amount of time for me to arrive at that conclusion when I was watching this. Back under the waterfall, everyone is pretty jazzed about everything. Blue Eyes got himself a girlfriend named Lake, and later that night the apes discuss leaving the waterfall. Winter wants to leave that night as the soldiers are getting pretty close, but they talk about how they need to plan first. Little do they know, they probably should have left like that minute, really. Later that night, when most of the troop has gone to bed, Caesar sees a light in the waterfall. As he goes over, he reaches out and finds a rope, which means the humans are here. He tells Blue Eyes to protect his mother and brother, and then goes on to find the patrol tasked with guarding the group. After rousing the troop, Blue Eyes is seen taking out one soldier, but another pretty much has got his sights trained on him. Over the radio, the Colonel is heard saying that King Kong is dead as Caesar goes to confront him. The Colonel has taken out Caesar's wife and his son, but accidentally left him alive. Colonel then makes his escape before Caesar is able to get to him, and thus kicks off a blood feud. Later they realize that they can't find Winter, so betrayal seems likely, but his youngest son Cornelius is still alive. The next morning, everyone decides it's time to nope out of there and head towards the desert that Blue Eyes was talking about. Caesar instructs Lake to take care of Cornelius while he goes on a blood rampage. Maurice attempts to get him to come with them, but Caesar declines, and so a small group decides to accompany Caesar, consisting of Maurice, Rocket, and Luca. Setting out, they find a small outcropping area. Moving through, they find one lone man. As he drops his firewood, he goes for his force multiplier, and Caesar annihilates him pretty quickly as he's done being Ranger McFriendly to these damn dirty humans. They question why he is out here alone, but as they head inside, they find a little girl. She appears not to be able to speak, which is concerning to Maurice. Maurice says that she will meet her end out here if they don't take her with them, so they end up yeeting her onto a horse and then taking off. Her reaction to her assumedly ended father seems a little stunted, right? Well, that'll be discussed later. Eventually, the apes are able to find the soldier encampment where they find Winter with a brand new brand on his head. They surround him and question him, where's the Colonel? Winter mentions how the soldiers are coming down from the north to join them, so the donkeys think the soldiers are really coming down to finish off the apes for good. Caesar tells Winter that his son and wife are gone, and before he can scream for help, they sort of, I guess, choke him out. I mean, if I remember correctly, he's not actually seen it anywhere else in the movie, so I guess he's actually dead. Very strange. Anyhow, Caesar starts having nightmares about Koba because he's becoming like him now, and the next morning the soldiers are loaded up and leaving, and they give chase. Now, they're out on an open beach. My dude, you'd be so easily spotted, but somehow they aren't. You know, plot demands it. But as they reach the snowy mountains, they find the soldiers have been taken out, or at least a few of them have, from their own for some reason. One guy is still alive, and they ask him why he was shot, but he's not able to answer what happened, to which they relate that to the little girl as well. Baffled by what they have seen, they move on, but as the group ascends a tower to look out over the area in search of the soldiers, a figure approaches and begins stealing out of the packs of one of the apes. As he does, he is spotted by Luca, who then lets out a yell. They give chase and corner him inside of a building. Turns out he's also an ape who thought he was stealing from humans, though after he saw them yell up top, why not just stop? Anyhow, he allows them to stay, but he also says that he has information on where the border is, which means he has information on where the Colonel is. The next morning, after some convincing of Bad Ape, which his name is Bad Ape, they all set off into the mountains and eventually discover the soldiers' main camp. A surprise attack happens on Luca and Caesar, but Rocket is able to jump in and knock the soldiers out. Luca, however, was injured gravely in the fight and then ends up meeting his end shortly after. Caesar says it was a mistake to bring everyone here and that he's going to go in alone. Also, I like how the little girl cried more when the gorilla passed than when her father did. Pretty bizarre. I mean, the gorilla just kind of gave her a flower. It didn't seem like it was that special of an arrangement. Anyhow, as Caesar heads off on his own, he finds multiple apes strung up as a warning. He recognizes them from his own troop and then discovers they've all been captured and put behind fences. He drops one of his apes, who tells them that they came out of nowhere and ambushed them. The humans plan to use them as a labor force before they expire, and then Caesar is knocked out by bigger ape. Coming to, the Colonel is talking to him, really riling him up, all the good stuff, and Caesar says he's here to take out the Colonel for taking out his wife and son. Caesar is then thrown into cages with the rest of the group, separated from the baby monkeys, and everything really just kind of sucks for a while. The next morning, the soldiers then line up as the Colonel comes outside shaving his head and whatnot, and then they enter the cages and start beating everyone as the apes are then brought out to kind of do their labor. Lake tells Caesar that they've had no food or water since they've been there, and after a collapse of a wall, one of the orangutans starts getting reprimanded for it. Caesar eventually yells for them to leave him, which causes them both to be punished, and that ape and Caesar are then brought to the front after it seems like a revolt is about to take place. They end up taking out the orangutan as Caesar says the apes need food and water, but the colonel wants them to get back to work. Lake holds up a rock in an effort to not have Caesar's brain splattered, and it works. Luckily, the remaining members of Caesar's scouting party have not been located and are watching from afar. Later that night, Caesar is strung up but released by the gorilla to talk to the colonel. The colonel then warns Caesar that he will slaughter the apes if they stop working. They'll get food and water when they are done with all the labor. Caesar then deduces that the soldiers coming down from the north are not there to join the colonel, and Caesar goes on to mention how this is because he takes out his own men based on the bodies that he has found. He goes on to say something must be wrong with his men. The colonel then divulges what's happening. The reason the colonel spat in the face of Caesar's mercy is really one that sort of makes sense actually. He goes on to discuss how humanity attempted to bend nature to its will, but nature was punishing humanity. The apes are stronger and likely smarter than humans, which for a time wouldn't have been an issue, but humans would have become like cattle to the apes. Now, however, the virus has mutated, robbing humanity of its ability to communicate, higher thinking, and anything that makes them human, meaning the apes will inherit the earth. The colonel had to take out his own son to stop the virus from spreading, and he fears the virus will wipe out humanity for good this time, and while it might not totally take them out, he's basically right. It will wipe out humanity for good, and he goes on to discuss how the soldiers coming from the north are part of the military he's in, but after what the colonel did, he was alleviated of his command. He says that he told them that if they want to alleviate him, then they will have to come here and stop him. So a battle is about to begin in his holy war, and the colonel doesn't want it to become a planet of the apes. Oh, he said it. Outside of the base, Rocket and Maurice and Bad Ape are discussing how to get in. After Bad Ape takes off running, he then finds a hole in the ground, and this hole leads to underneath the base via pipes, which might be usable in helping the other apes escape. As Caesar continues to be strung up, he hallucinates Koba talking to him, but it's actually the gorilla cutting him down. Also, a little girl is able to make her way through an entire base with like little difficulty. Man, these soldiers are really on high alert considering, there's a bunch of soldiers coming down from the north to kind of take them out. How do they know it's going to be a large group? It could just be like a small specialist group. Anyway, she offers the doll to Caesar and then gets him some water so he doesn't bite the dust, which gives him some strength, and then she carries over some remaining food, and now he's back up to operating capacity. Soldiers continue their rounds, and Rocket ends up coming out to get their attention. He fights the gorilla and then is dragged into the pen and beaten up, but survives and signals to Caesar about escaping. The next morning, when Caesar is released from his cage, the doll is found, and the colonel wonders where that came from, but doesn't do too much about it. As they work, they begin signaling to one another about how many there are of them. Maurice and Bad Ape continue working underneath the holding pens to release their troop. Bad Ape counts the steps, and they discover a pipe just above them that leads to the ape's holding pen. As they break through, they find the tunnel is starting to flood if they keep digging at the quarry, so they have to stop work without eating it. So a quick plan is devised, and then they throw their crap. Hitting a soldier up on the catwalk, they get him to come down to the holding pen. As he walks in, he's hit with more, and then walks over the hole that is dug, and then immediately brought down, and they get the keys off him. With the apes free, they then release the rest of the group, and all of them head into the tunnel to escape. Caesar, though, wants to stay behind and take out the colonel. Just as they escape, the battle kicks off to relieve the colonel of his command. As soldiers run through, they realize all the apes have escaped, and they try to get to the colonel in his dwelling, but they aren't able to open the door. Caesar then climbs up and finds that the colonel is not doing so hot. Unable to speak and seemingly more primitive, Caesar goes to take him out but then stops. Seeing the doll, the colonel has been infected with this new variant of virus. Colonel is basically worse off alive now. That said, the colonel then domes himself shortly after. With the battle in full swing, Caesar goes to destroy fuel tanks powering the facility, but as he does, he is tagged with an arrow to the side. He's then able to destroy the tanks anyhow as the guy with the crossbow catches the grenade and then runs off into the mountains. Due to the actual battle taking place, a giant avalanche is brought down on the soldiers, annihilating everyone in the process except the apes. What a stroke of luck! The apes then head off to their new home as Caesar is getting weaker. He tells Maurice that he likely will not make it, and then ends up meeting his end at his new home. And I just want to say, this ape took like a bullet, but an arrow to the back took him out? I mean, bummer, dude. But there are worse things coming the ape's way, and it's known as Marky Mark Crashy Crash Landing into the future after his shuttle entered some sort of time warp, fleeing them, I guess, when the apes are already well established. Godspeed and good luck to you, you damn dirty apes. You'll need it. So holy cow, I mean, that was a long one. Legitimately, I didn't think Planet of the Apes would be as interesting as it was, but with the virus and sequence of events leading up to the apes becoming the dominant species, I was kind of rather interested in watching it, and it sort of makes you hate the human race. So the first thing though I wanted to talk about is starting with ALZ 112 112 and the effects it had on humans and apes alike, and why they should have likely just stopped there. ALZ 112 was initially created as a way to combat Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is a disease where different protein structures build up in the brain, choking out neurons, but also the neurons themselves self-destruct in ways that eventually result in holes being formed in the brain. This disease over time robs you of your memories, your fluid movements, and really just your humanity. An absolutely horrendous way for one of the smartest species on the planet to go, having the one organ responsible for everything we can accomplish slowly degrade from underneath us. Upon ALZ 112 being used on Will's father, he quickly learned that the body would do what the body would do, and that is adapt to what it perceives as an invader. If it didn't, then we would all be nothing but virus factories until our species went extinct from being a virus factory. The body was coming into contact with ALZ 112, and although it took a fair amount of time, eventually the body was able to develop antibodies to medicine, which ultimately rendered it inert. This process would likely have been slow at first, but with the effects of ALZ 112 negated, the brain would quickly continue on. This says a few things to me about how ALZ 112 works once it enters the brain. The first thing that ALZ 112 is known for is neurogenesis, which essentially is the creation of new brain cells, and this allows the brain to recover from Alzheimer's. As new neurons are added into the fray or new dendritic connections are made, this allows for the brain to continue operating at what was once a normal capacity, but this also points out a critical flaw with the medicine. It does not outright stop the progression of the disease, which is a critical portion to stop if you want the lasting effects. So here's why Will's father went downhill so fast, even though he received injections monthly every year. As the neurons were created, the brain was still suffering from the ill effects of Alzheimer's, and neurogenesis was just able to stay out in front of the brain-destroying disease. As the brain created new neurons, the pathways were able to be maintained, but likely what was happening is the beta amyloid plaques were still building up in the brain, even though the brain was capable of compensating for a short while. As these plaques choked out more and more neurons, eventually an almost equilibrium would be reached with the brain until the body created antibodies. Once this happened, the neurodegeneration was continuing on as normal, but almost to the point of which no one has survived. Well, no one has survived, and then it went past that point of how quickly it would degrade a brain. So from here, the plaques would take out so many neurons so quickly, his disease seemingly came back with a vengeance. In humans, it was able to last as long as it did because of the weaker immune systems. In apes, however, likely had they continued to run trials, this virus would have shown soon, possibly even years sooner, that it was not a permanent fix to the disease. However, the virus seemingly does not just stick to the brain, and it would seem, which is really kind of expected, as it was attempting to propagate as much as possible. Within the eggs of Caesar's mother, an egg would likely become infected, or even possibly when Caesar was a fetus. Considering he was so young, the virus would work its way into his neurons and then begin setting for neural connections at a much faster rate, as well as increasing gray matter quicker over a short period of time, which is shown as he progresses well beyond what a human is capable of a similar age group. This doubling of gray matter within his brain made him much smarter than obviously his peers and humans, but at this point the virus had affected his genome. The reasoning for this may be as simple as how Caesar was raised. In primates, and mammals in general, we receive most of our antibodies from our mother's milk when we are breastfed, and this sort of bridges the gap of time when we are infants and our immune system is really kind of weaker and definitely not strong or really functioning well on its own. Considering Caesar was taken away from his mother at a day old, and as far as I know, Will can't produce breast milk containing antibodies, the virus had essentially free reign in his body. The virus was integrated into his being at this point because there was nothing to counter it, meaning that the weaker virus was quite capable of existing within him permanently, and his body would become accustomed to it, which may explain why the first night at Will's house, Caesar was sick. That was an underdeveloped immune system attempting a response, but failing. Think it's crazy? Well, really it's not if you look at it. So look at the herpes virus, for instance. When you are initially infected, you may develop flu-like symptoms, but the virus is permanently in you as it's attached itself to nerve clusters and even infected the nerves themselves. The same idea can be applied to Caesar. Likely his mother, she may not have needed monthly injections if she did not suffer from neurodegenerative disorders, but her intelligence would have been more limited as her body would have responded eventually to the virus trying to create alterations to the cell. So a nice way of summing up what ALZ 112 does is this. If you are human without cognitive degeneration issues, the virus would make you more intelligent, but eventually the body would produce antibodies rendering the virus inert, but you would still retain that intelligence that you have built up over 5 years. Ideally, this would usher in a utopia for humanity as genius becomes average. If you are human with dementia, it can maintain a balance keeping you at your original level of intellect, but once the body produces antibodies, it's game over. If you are an ape receiving shots, you would maintain the intellect gain, but it would be less as the immune system is stronger. And if you are infected as an infant under the right circumstances, you may actually have it passed down to you through your mother's blood supply, which ultimately makes you more intelligent. However, the issue was, Will attempted to save his father outright and wasn't happy with the extra 5 years that he got. In this effort to harness nature to combat nature, he would go on to create the downfall of humanity, ALZ 113. And this is where the issues began cropping up. ALZ 112 was a fairly weak virus, something the body could overcome. ALZ 113 was never intended to be overcome. The body was forced to deal with this invader permanently, but they needed it to really have no ill effects. The issue was, however, testing wasn't carried out all the way that it was supposed to be, and this new version had a much more aggressive virus that apes were capable of handling, humans were not. After the initial exposure event of Franklin being infected and sneezing on a pilot, and thus the pilot carrying it across the world, humanity was pretty much screwed at this point. Dubbed simian flu to shift the blame away from the fact that it was created in a lab and not in nature, the intention was to show that it was the apes' fault. This bred a lot of hatred towards the apes if you didn't know that already. 48 hours after exposure, people would report severe headaches, sore throats, weakness, fever, and joint pain, all indicators that the innate immune system is coming across the virus. 36 hours, nausea, vomiting, red eyes, raised rash, and chest pain, as well as cough, would begin forming in people, showing that the body was basically in a panic, attempting to thwart whatever was invading. 7 days after the infection, and stomach pain was immense as blood was likely dripping into the back of the throat and down into the stomach because you were bleeding from your nose, mouth, rectum, and eyes. Severe weight loss, as the fluids leaked out everywhere, was also fairly common. Essentially, you were a dead man walking. It's clear to me that the virus chosen for ALZ 113 was likely a form of an Ebola virus. It's clear this virus was likely weakened in some way, however, as you didn't really want it just completely ending people, or at least that was the plan, but you did want its virulence and infectivity. This tampering with the virus is why apes are able to survive exposure to it consistently, whereas humans would drop. In fact, initially it was believed 1 in 10 humans may survive infection, but that number quickly dropped to 1 in 500, meaning that it took a certain type of immune system within humans to even be able to survive the infection. As ALZ 113 continued to make apes more intelligent, the fact is not known whether these apes cleared it or not. Likely it stuck around in them longer than the original ALZ 112, and this would make them much more intelligent over a longer period of time. But it also had the added effect of implanting itself in the genes of apes, which in turn made them consistently produce offspring that were smarter and would ultimately go on to become the new dominant form on the planet. Now, the thing is, likely ALZ 113 would have a similar effect of increasing gray matter in the brain and also dendritic connections, which would ultimately be our downfall. Before getting there, we have to understand, though, the differences between human and chimpanzee immune systems. So I have 2 examples for you to show the stark differences between humans and apes. The fact is, humans are giant nerds and we are weaker as a result of our more clean lifestyle and just the naturally occurring immune cells within us. The biggest dichotomy is between how humans and apes react to HIV and SIV. When an ape contracts simian immunodeficiency virus, they too possess CD4 T cells much like humans, yet the disease never progresses to the point of AIDS. Apes are a lot of times naturally infected with SIV, and to their bodies the virus does not go wildly out of control, and they are able to survive fairly unimpacted by it. Humans, on the other hand, when contracting human immunodeficiency virus without aggressive medical intervention and medications, will expire within about 3 to 7 years as it progresses to AIDS, allowing for opportunistic infections to flourish. Even with medical intervention, the HIV virus will never fully leave the body, even when it reaches undetectable levels. With our close relation, apes are able to live quite happily with the virus, and it absolutely destroys humans, so why is this? Well, we're just completely different. The second example is the herpes simplex virus 1 and the herpes simplex virus 2. HSV1 is a human-born strain of herpes. As such, it's adapted to our bodies, and our bodies are actually relatively adapted to it. Because of that, it is seen as the less aggressive form of herpes, creating things like cold sores, though you can absolutely get cold sores on your crotch, so be careful out there. Herpes simplex virus 2 is believed to come from chimpanzees. In chimps, the virus is a lot like how HSV1 is in humans. It's less aggressive and not as detrimental to the epithelial layers of cells. However, back when we all had a lot more hair, possibly around the time that we were Homo erectus, someone got freaky with a chimp. HSV2 was able to jump over to our genus at that point, and thus it moved from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens, and now we are plagued with a more aggressive form of herpes because our bodies are relatively new to this type of virus and we can't control it as effectively. These 2 examples highlight how different our 2 forms of life are at combating diseases despite us looking somewhat similar, at least, sharing a common ancestor millions of years ago. And apes typically just have a flat out stronger immune system than we do, and that is more aggressive at, taking care of bacteria, viruses, and parasites and keeping them in check more readily than ours virus can. And this is why ALZ 113 is so insidious. Just below the threshold of what apes could naturally handle, but above the threshold of what most humans could handle. The fact of the matter is, as soon as Franklin's mask was kicked off, that should have been an immediate quarantine event. At least that's what my lab would have done, or any self-respecting lab out there, but I digress. Essentially, they shot themselves in the foot and also shot humanity in the foot doing this. As ALZ 113 began spreading across the globe, not only was it respiratory in nature, but could also be contracted through things like direct contact or indirect contact with objects and surfaces. It rapidly infected humans, which we would have all seen at this point, just how rapidly respiratory diseases go, and this would induce the bleeding that we have seen as blood vessels burst quite readily all over the body. And this resulted in a 99.8% lethality rate and the population flatlining, which only left a paltry 16 million left on the planet. And this would indicate to some degree that this altered form is actually Ebola that we were dealing with based on mutation rate. Almost 15 years after the outbreak, the virus had remained fairly stable, and this is a characteristic that we have seen with Ebola. In our actual real world, samples taken back in 1976, still to this day, the new form of virus is 97% similar to that original form. And this would make it fairly viable as a candidate for Will to turn to because of its low mutation rate, but also its infectivity and aggressiveness when infecting humans. It would basically make sure it would force its way into your cells, and your body would likely not develop a resistance to it. It is known of those 16 million humans left, every one of them was infected with the virus. The doctor mentions how genetically they are immune to the most damaging effects, but really it's just their body keeping the virus at bay, or they are likely either coexisting with it in their bodies, and even possibly the virus is not able to get a foothold, but I kind of tend to go with the latter over the former, and here's my reasoning on that. During the bubonic plague era, those with a delta 32 allele mutation, that meant the co-receptor on the surface was never fully exiting the cell membrane or was completely covered, allowed them to survive the bubonic plague, and those traits got passed down. What's interesting is, if you have this mutation, you are either somewhat resistant or immune to contracting HIV. Now, immune is a strong term, as the virus is basically so mutagenic that it can change within literally just a few days and attack some other co-receptor, but the key here is that the delta 32 allele mutation makes it exceedingly tough for HIV virus to get a foothold in humans, propagate. And this is what I believe is happening with those 16 million. Somehow, some way, likely the co-receptors on their cells are making it difficult for the virus to get a foothold in their bodies. Because of this, they never crashed out and were effectively immune due to their genetics. However, much like how HIV can mutate and infect someone with the delta 32 allele mutation, so too can the simian flu. After 15 years and ransacking humanity, the virus would change. As it changed, it's pretty clear whatever co-receptor barrier that was stopping the virus from entering the cells of the body was no longer a factor, as likely another co-receptor was used. Upon this happening, the virus would once again spread quickly amongst the human population, except because of this mutation, the end result changed. Rather than just crash out the human body, it would instead cause them to regress, to become more primitive. It wouldn't end them, as clearly the adults could go on to thrive, have children, and basically return to monkey themselves because of their inability to speak, rationalize, or learn things like they used to. And judging by the little girl after seeing her father taken out, being emotionally stunted. So you're probably asking yourself, well, why is this? Well, I believe the virus is technically doing its intended work on increasing gray matter and connections, much like we have seen in the apes, but humans are just the susceptible species. Apes that come into contact with ALZ 113 still have the immune system in place to combat the virus, and thus are rendered an unaffected population because of it, or at least detrimentally unaffected. But when humans are infected, the genetic mutation that saved the last remaining people was no longer enough to save them from the mutated version. Shortly after coming into contact with ALZ 113-2, I guess we'll call it, it would go into the brain of a person and likely ramp up production of neurogenesis. But wait, this sounds like a good thing, doesn't it? After all, that's what saved Will's dad and then also made the apes smarter, but that's actually the problem. There's this idea that if we just had bigger brains and more connections, humans would be smarter. But actually, we are about close naturally to the limit of how intelligent we can be without interventions from robotics. In fact, there's this theory, or really hypothesis, I guess you could say, that the next form of humanity will be Homo cyborgus, because we'll actually literally start slapping on basically robotic portions of us, and then when the organic form of us finally is done away with, we'll be Homo machinus. It's pretty interesting, we'll see what happens. But back to the whole conversation about our brains. Now, our brains could get a bit larger, just so you know, and we would still be okay, which would actually still translate into more intelligence due to our relative body size. But if our brains got too large, it would have the opposite intended effect. If our brains were to, say, double in size or double in connections, it would actually be incredibly harmful to humans. Our thoughts would be slower, as signals would have to travel through more tissue, leading to more activation of other areas, which in turn could just be perceived as noise. If you were to double the connections in the brain, this would slow down nerve impulses to the point that intelligence would actually start going backwards for a person. Essentially, from where humans are right now, adding more brain matter and connections after a certain point would actually just kind of make us dumb. And this is what I believe is happening to the infected with the mutated version. While the Ebola virus became less virulent and severe for those who didn't bleed out from the first version, this version would continue adding gray matter to the brain of a person unchecked, with the body having no way to fight back as it's the freaking Ebola virus. This in turn would have unchecked consequences. With the neurons in the skull doubling up, this could quickly result in speech being lost as the connections made would take too long to formulate a response, which causes the stuttering and confusion by their inability to speak that we see in everyone's eyes. On top of this, it is mentioned higher thought is lost. Formulating speech, the conveyance of ideas, and understanding is an extremely delicate balance built up over millions of years of interaction with one another. And even still, it's not like we've mastered it. People speak different languages, for example. But with the extra gray matter in the skull, this impedes logical thinking and the conveyance of ideas, as well as almost returning those infected back to an animalistic state, as they now must rely on instincts, which is ingrained heavily in the brain and body to survive. And this is why we never see humanity climb back up the totem pole, and why the apes are so surprised that humans can speak in the Planets of the Apes series. And speaking of speaking, this part is a bit strange for apes, just so we know. We're just going to cover that real quick. Humans can speak because of our vocal cords and structures associated with it. There are sacs actually in the ape's throat which help them yell loudly but do not facilitate speech. So I don't really care how smart Caesar is, he would not be talking even a throaty speech like he does simply because of his voice box. It's just not set up for speech. That's like asking a human to effectively swing from tree to tree consistently without fatigue simply because we see apes do it. Our bodies just aren't built for that, and chimpanzees' throats aren't built for speech. All in all, ALZ 112 and ALZ 113 were good ideas in attempt, but with emotion getting in the way and choosing such a dangerous virus as well as human error along the way, A, not quarantining the handler immediately, and B, treating literal sapient apes as less than you, humanity sealed their fate to be the animals of the planet while our less evolved cousins stepped up and became the dominant species. However, now they have to worry about Mark Wahlberg showing up with his standard confused look on his face, although I guess they should be used to that considering most humans probably look confused with our slowed down brains.